In 1914, Australian women were largely seen in a domestic setting as mothers, wives and homemakers. When war broke, women were encouraged to mobilise in support and volunteer roles. In great numbers, women applied themselves to a range of diverse experiences on the home front, signing up with one or more of the many volunteer organisations, fundraising and community support groups across the country. There was a modest increase in their numbers in the workforce, in teaching and administrative roles. There was also a wartime rise in women factory workers, though the opportunities were short-lived, as unions lobbied hard to ensure they weren't given permanent positions in favour of men. Throughout the war, patriotic fundraising assisted government efforts in caring for sick, wounded and incapacitated soldiers and their dependents, as well as civilians caught up in the conflict overseas. The range of wartime fundraising efforts were diverse, from the Australian Comforts Fund that cared for the fit and well soldier, to the Blue Cross Fund that cared for the thousands of horses that accompanied the troops. One of the most popular and practical initiatives was the Comforts Parcel, which contained food, books and other mementos such as sprigs of wattle to remind soldiers of home. The most influential and dominant charity formed in response to war was the Australian branch of the British Red Cross Society. Established in August 1914 by Lady Helen Munro Ferguson, wife of the Governor-General, the Australian Red Cross had its headquarters in Melbourne, with divisions in each state, run by the wives of state governors. Thousands of Australian women flocked to the organisation, established to assist wounded and sick soldiers, and help dependents and civilians caught up in the war. By June 1918, there were roughly 2,400 active Red Cross branches nationwide, with a predominantly female membership. An essential component of the Red Cross was its unpaid army of volunteers, the Voluntary Aid Detachments, known as VADs. Armed with first aid and home nursing training, VADs became the public face of the Red Cross, attending to the sick dressed in white uniforms with a recognisable Red Cross stitched onto the bosom or sleeve. VADs undertook traditional women's domestic labour of cooking, cleaning, washing, serving and nursing in the hospitals and convalescent homes across the country, whilst others ventured overseas and were stationed at military hospitals on all fronts of the war. From the middle of 1916, when Australian soldiers began to experience the scale of devastation witnessed on the Western Front, the increasing demands of repatriation of the wounded added significantly to the demands for veteran assistance. In response, the federal government established the Department of Repatriation in 1917 to address this responsibility. But the efforts of patriotic fundraising would continue to play a crucial role, not only in addressing the unmet demand beyond the new department's mission, but also into the post-war period, where the economic downturn and depression that resulted from the war affected large areas of Australian society. With the help from voluntary organisations, Australian women and their families sought to rebuild their lives. Alongside thousands of widows and fatherless children were women who had to cope with battle-scarred fathers, husbands and sons with a range of physical illnesses and psychological trauma. Australian women also played a role in the political upheaval war brought to the home front. Despite the public appearance of total support for Great Britain, there was strong opposition to the war in some areas of society. Anti-war activists, including Vida Goldstein and Cecilia John, founded the Women's Peace Army in July 1915. With its motto, "We war against war," the group attracted many women to its cause. Alongside organisations such as the Sisterhood of International Peace and the Quakers, these women and the organisations they formed remained politically active and influential throughout the war years. Having had the right to vote since 1902, Australian women were crucially involved in the nation's 2 public votes for compulsory conscription, first in October 1916 and again in December 1917. Women became targets for both pro- and anti-conscription propaganda in both sides' attempts to influence opinion. Ultimately, both votes failed to enforce conscription, and the Australian Imperial Force remained an all-volunteer army. The 1917 vote was particularly divisive. It came on the heels of an industrial dispute which began between railway workers and the government and spread across New South Wales and Victoria. The so-called Great Strike became a symbol for a more widespread public disgruntlement at the meteoric rise in the costs of living faced by Australians. Hundreds of women were involved in rallies and demonstrations. Others volunteered as strikebreakers, serving in railway and tramshed canteens. In the years after the war, new areas of paid work for Australian women emerged, and the female workforce slowly increased, particularly in the business and manufacturing sectors. Australian society was deeply challenged and permanently altered by the events and consequences of the First World War. Alongside these transformations came a gradual improvement in women's lives and rights, a direct result of Australian women's wartime activities on the home front. With 417,000 men enlisting in the Australian Imperial Force from a population of around 5 million, few families and communities remained untouched by the war. In May 1915, weeks after the beginning of the Gallipoli campaign, the first Australian casualties were reported in the press, alongside their official portraits. It marked the first time the general public was exposed to the human cost of the conflict. And as the months passed and the numbers of dead and wounded soared, so too these pictorial honour rolls disappeared from circulation. By the end of the war, more than 60,000 Australian soldiers and 29 nurses had died. Of the 156,000 casualties who came home, at least 90,000 were deemed physically or mentally unfit, a tragic homecoming that would permanently alter tens of thousands of family networks. Bolstered by philanthropic donations, the government established military hospitals around the country to support the most severely disabled, as well as those showing severe signs of psychological trauma. The Australian Red Cross organised and staffed rehabilitation and convalescent homes to supplement the nation's overloaded health services. In most cases, the burden of care for thousands of incapacitated Anzacs fell to their families, more often to mothers, since the majority of those who enlisted were young, unmarried men. But the sheer scale of returned servicemen in need of long-term health care and rehabilitation placed a huge and unfamiliar burden on Australia's medical and charity networks. To address the demand, the federal government formed the Repatriation Department in September 1917. Known as REPAT, the department was tasked with handling all the financial, domestic and healthcare needs of servicemen and their dependents. The government provided loans to assist in the purchasing of homes and land, and created an agricultural farming scheme to encourage soldiers and their families to resettle in rural and regional areas. Around 40,000 veterans nationwide took advantage of the Soldiers' Settlement Scheme, in which the government allotted undeveloped plots of land for pastoral or agricultural farming. As most of the productive land had already been settled, many returning soldiers were issued allotments with infertile soil or a susceptibility to droughts and floods. Confronted with these environmental challenges, many inexperienced veterans struggled to make an income or repay their debts. By the time the Great Economic Depression hit Australia in the late 1920s, the pressures were too great for many settlers to overcome, and with few choices to hand, many veterans walked away from their land, went bankrupt, or committed suicide. 20 years after the settlement scheme had been implemented, less than half the soldiers remained on their properties. A veteran's reflection on the hardship his family faced included this observation: "I have battled on the starvation block of mine for 6 years, lived in a hut with my wife and family only fit for animals, drank bore water only fit for stock. I had 4 years active service with the Australian Infantry Force as a sergeant and have a clean sheet, and now I have to put up with ridiculous demands. I'm fed up with the whole affair." They can have my block if they want it. For those who witnessed war, the impact of their experiences would last a lifetime. By 1926, 22,000 veterans were continuing to receive ongoing hospital care, and by 1939, this number had risen to 49,000. The enduring psychological and emotional effects of war destabilized family networks for years after the war. Psychological breakdowns, domestic violence and suicide were all hallmarks of the difficulty of returning from the war. One prominent post-war casualty was Major General Harold Edward Elliott, known popularly as Pompey Elliott. His inspirational leadership and loyalty to the men under his command at Gallipoli and on the battles of the Western Front endures as an indelible aspect of the Anzac legend. But the tactical blunders and huge casualties Elliott witnessed as a commander continued to haunt him for years after the war had ended. After a prolonged struggle with depression and ill health, and despite strong family connections, Pompey Elliott committed suicide in 1931, aged 52. For so many veterans, returning to civilian life was at least as tough as going to war, and the role of the Returned Sailors and Soldiers Imperial League of Australia, known today as the RSL, emerged as a vital and understanding community for those whose sense of purpose, identity and belonging was lessened on their return to their homeland. Whilst some bereaved families could find solace in prevailing notions of honour and sacrifice, others whose sons or husbands were lost to the battlefields were forced to live on in ignorance of their loved ones' fates. To support a nation in recovery, commemorative monuments, memorials and honour rolls were raised across Australia to allow quietly grieving and contemplative communities to honour those who served. From the years of the First World War up until the present day, the profundity of service began to register in the lives of Australians. To this day, war's deep and lasting connection to the human condition and its impact on the Australian way of life continues to shape the nation's collective identity.